Hey everyone, another one of these slanted articles that was written for the police and goes back about 6 years ago. But I want to go through about 8 points in this article, which helps to mislead the public more than help the public understand. It's clearly in favor of law enforcement and clearly does not bring up some of the key metrics that we have discovered in looking at a law enforcement. Here it's Law Enforcement Bulletin written by the FBI and looks very official. They even have emails and Twitter accounts and everything. I mean, they're really plugged in much more than I am. And you can see the date up here, undercover chatting with CSOs, new designation. So immediately they assume in this article that if you are a child and you have a smartphone, they said 95% of those do, that they're necessarily on chatting with people who would do them harm. That is the immediate assumption from reading this article. It says the ever increasing usage of social media sites and messaging apps implies that CSOs now can have instantaneous virtual access to children. Can, but don't always. There's some evidence that they do not cite, of course, down here, which suggests that children do a pretty good job of interacting with adults and pushing them away. The problem that is never brought up is what do you do with the LGBTQ kid, particularly boys who are of a certain age, 15, 16, 17, who do reach out to adults? And worse yet, what do you do about the police who pretend to be these boys, or in some cases, these girls as young as 12, which the research suggests do not go online looking for older men? But the police officers do is the decoys, and that's never brought up. What do you do about that problem? Because that's the dirty little secret that never shows up in any of these articles. So the article goes on to talk about how these noble officers have made 71,000 investigations and arrested more than 9,000 individuals. Okay. So they, arrest somewhere around, 10, 12%, something like that. Sorry, my math isn't super easy, but you can get the point. If you look at this, it doesn't say anything about their investigations. It goes on to talk about proactive and reactive stings. See, some of these are proactive, where officers impersonate a child or an adult to apprehend suspects before they offend. Sounds like a great idea. Sounds wonderful. And you go down to footnote 4 here, and footnote 4, it talks about this phenomenon. But Mitchell and Wolak and Finkelhor don't support these police officers as much as they claim. They point out that the effectiveness of these and how they have a tendency to nab people who are not necessarily going to harm children. They do bring up, even though there is a slant toward people who are going to try to hurt children, that's the only reference in this article. The one very minor reference that supports law enforcement. So you have that nonsense here. What they don't tell you too is that most of their stings are in fact proactive. They're not reactive. They're not intervening in an undercover capacity after a suspect solicits a child online. You have to understand, notice how they're conflating these reactive ones as you get a hot tip and you go after it. Okay. But how do you know a child was solicited if the police are the ones being the decoy and engaging you? Do they call that reactive? Because according to their own statistics, as much as you can make sense of them, 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 times, it's a proactive sting, a fishing expedition, excuse me, not a reactive one. So again, the dishonesty continues. It's really amazing here. So the whole purpose of the chats, according to these articles, this article assumes that there's a predation going on, assumes that an adult is hunting for the child, and the police, therefore, should be there just looking. Of course, we know that they don't just look, they get actively engaged. And I'm not going to go through all of the italicized bits here where the police talk about what they do and how, the police are there to protect the people from the really bad guy. They never say in these articles what police do to initiate conversations, which increasingly we find, and increasingly, thank God, the courts are starting to see as well. Okay, so the police role is never discussed. And yet, I reported last night, based on other people's reporting, that anecdotally, people who follow these things are discovering that police assault others on average one a day. And when the Washington Post reported, excuse me, from their 17-year investigation, culminating in 2022, they found over 1,800 cases where police officers abused children, mostly girls, between the ages of 12 and 15, I think it was, taking advantage of their badges in certain programs where kids want to find out about law enforcement and potential career in law enforcement. Took advantage of them. That ended up being something like 8.8 times. I'm trying to remember now if it was a week or a month, but certainly a lot more than you would think. And certainly because many of these are unreported, as social scientists and police will tell you, it's probably much more, right? That's fair to say, isn't it? If it's fair to say for the average and ordinary citizen, it's fair to say that it's underreported for police as well. Okay. So the police talk about how they have to be very, very dedicated to it. But what they don't say is the truth. They talk about the all-consuming desire that these people have for having sex with children. Okay. And that you have to work outside the 9 to 5. You have to build a relationship with them, they say. Okay. So they start out again not talking about what the police really do. They assume that any talk that is even accidental with the child is necessarily exploitation. And that also isn't true. But they bring up something very, very interesting here as well. They talk about how they keep little statistics of their persona and how they, so that they can keep track of the lies that they tell somebody when they approach that person. Now, they don't tell you about the approach. They just tell you how they have a tracking sheet in case they are thrown any curveballs. The word they use here is meaning questions, not as they say that are oddball questions, but where the target says, well, this doesn't really comport with what we're talking about. I'm talking to an adult, and that's not what you're saying to me. They also talk about how people who are on these sites very often are fantasizing. Okay, they're fantasizing, and because they're fantasizing, they're engaging in fantasy play, but they're equating fantasy play with fulfilling an actual contact with the child. And they will say sometimes these people never go and meet the child and we go after them instead. Okay. Psychologists will tell you, and we've seen several of these now, where there are different types of predation, and some just want to engage in fantasy play. But fantasy play is not criminal, but they treat it as though it is. They treat it as though it's the completion of an act. It's a thought crime. Imagine if you were dreaming about robbing a bank and then they came and arrest you. And isn't there a movie out there that talks about that very same thing? What if your thoughts become a crime? Well, everybody's going to be under duress at some point anyway, right? So they really talk about criminalizing the fantasies. They talk about uh, the fact that these people must be interested in having sex with a child if only they had a chance. The last point I want to mention is that they only interview law enforcement. They don't interview psychologists. They don't interview people like me who have been stung. And I wish they would. It would be a nice change. We have Wired Magazine and Reason.com have done excellent pieces on this. John Oliver did a great piece on it, even though he's not a journalist. And others have done it as well for the Appeal magazine and others have worked hard to get the bottom of it, but that's a drop in the bucket, really, because they talk in this article too about compulsions that people have where they are going to meet a child, but the compulsion may not be for sex with the child. You know, think about it. People overeat. They don't even overeat because they want more food. Food is substitute for what they really want. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they're missing something in their life. Maybe they have an addiction. Maybe they have a social addiction. Maybe they have a borderline personality disorder. I'm not an expert, but I do know well enough on psychology that I can understand completely that compulsions that manifest in one way may have a deeper meaning somewhere along the line. And I'm going to post this article here so you can actually read it. Just understand it's extremely slanted and consider these 8 points or so that I have gone through rather quickly so that you can understand that what the police are telling you is not the whole truth.